And we are recording with Mr. Ray McGovern, and we were just talking about Legacy of Ashes over his shoulder. I'm on a bit of a CIA tear right now. I'm rereading that. I just finished for the first time The Devil's Chessboard and Family of Secrets, and I just started a book about Wild Bill or William Donovan. But Mr. McGovern, please introduce yourself to my audience and tell them who you are.
Sure. Well, Tommy, I'm glad to be with you today. I go back a ways. Majored in Russian in college because I was sick and tired of French and I needed a modern foreign language. And long story short, I decided to specialize in Russia. So I've been watching Russian leaders now off and on, almost always on for several decades, okay? So that gives me a little bit of experience, not enough experience to have anticipated what Putin did in invading Ukraine, I would confess. I thought he could achieve his aims without an invasion. I was wrong. I think I've figured out why I was wrong, and I was almost right, but almost doesn't count in my work. So I'd like to explain that. Let's see what else. I was commissioned in the Army Infantry Intelligence. Reported to active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Army Infantry School. And that was November 3rd, 1962. And it was a little bizarre because a lot of us were sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. You know, we heard about these new weapons like a grenade launcher. Wow, you know. So we wanted to be trained on that, right? So that we could lead our troops. There weren't any. There weren't any weapons at all. So we asked the NCOs, where are the weapons? And they said, they're all down in Key West. They're ready to go into Cuba. Now, that was my introduction as a Army infantry intelligence officer. That's how close we were to blowing the world up. It almost happened, by the way. Among the other things that we did not know, you know, CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency take great pride in saying, we discovered those missiles in Cuba. Yeah, they discovered them after they were not only deployed to Cuba, but after they were armed. What does armed mean? They had their warheads on them, right? So if Kennedy was not as astute a politician as he was, if it were not helped by the likes of the ambassador, just recently former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Llewellyn Thompson, who knew Russia just as well as George Kennan knew Russia. He insisted, by the way, that Thompson attend all the meetings, including Joint Chiefs of Staff every meeting, you know, to figure out what's going on. Anyhow, long story short, you and I, Tommy, can talk now because we're still alive. Our children and grandchildren, if you have any, are probably going to live at least as long as climate warming doesn't do us in, unless, and I say this, I mean, I can't believe that I have to say this, unless the people who think they can bait Putin to the point of tempting him to use nuclear weapons in this fracas in Ukraine, unless they succeed in dragging Biden and saying, President Biden, we're gonna lose the midterms for sure in November if you don't appear strong. So let's do that no-fly zone. Let's put those. In other words, if these crazies persuade Biden for whatever reason to reverse his rather cautious stance on getting involved in a war with Russia, well, then you don't have to worry about global warming anymore. The more so, and I just add this thought here. It's not a thought, it's a fact. As a matter of fact, I'm going to identify everything that's speculation on my part as speculation on my part, okay? What I say will be factually based. This fact is very disturbing. Something I learned just maybe 2 months ago. The Russian early warning system against nuclear attack is not half as good as ours. What do I mean by that? We had these really fancy satellites. I mean, it's a tribute to technology. They can find the launch of a nuclear missile anywhere in the world, like that. Find out where it's coming from. Russians can't do that. They don't have those kinds of satellites. What they have, is limited coverage of the world. They home in, of course, on our Midwest, where all our ICBMs are. But how about the oceans? How about the seas? They can't cover the seas. And there was an example back in 1995 where there was a launch of a missile in Norway. They couldn't tell, those Russian generals, they couldn't tell if that was the real thing or not. 1995, okay? Relations with the Yeltsin regime, since he was giving us everything we wanted, were very good, okay? So that was a cooling effect here. Probably they're not going to attack. The other thing was they did have our ICBMs monitored. There was no sign at all that they were ready to be fired, but they didn't know where the hell our sea-launched ballistic missiles were on a submarines as close as the North Atlantic. They haven't improved that system since. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that Putin has 8 minutes tops. Well, the Russians have 8 minutes. I mean, they have to detect it and identify it and then tell Putin, well, maybe he's got force. In other words, it's almost certain that Putin has devolved responsibility to fire these awful things to field units, so to speak, just automatically. He can't pause to ruminate and say, well, I've got 2 of these 8 seconds. Let me see. No. So that's how labil, as the Germans have this wonderful word, labil. It means precarious, but in spades. That's how labil the situation is. And I'm not sure that Biden even knows about it, because the Pentagon has been dismissive of doing things to attenuate that danger, for example, to letting the Russians know that we can know a lot more than they can, and we realize that, and so blah, 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 blah. In other words, we're not even talking to one another now. That's the real danger. I'll stop there for the nonce.
No, it's SLBM's that close. Yeah, he has a couple of minutes, which kind of like Dr. Strangelove. Well, it would only make sense that he would have devolved power, like wing attack plan R. You got to have, in the case of a decapitation strike or a timely response, retaliation, he would have had to devolve it. And back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And didn't they not find out till like many years later? I want to say decades later, that they were armed. Then we didn't know that until like the 90s, correct?
That's correct. So it's sort of an essential piece of information.
A little bit, a little essential. It's we were playing whack-a-mole, and it wasn't until decades later we found out some of the moles had nitroglycerin in them, and it was like it could have gone. And if Curtis LeMay had his way, we'd all be dead right now, because they want to go in and hammer it.
That's true. And there was a Soviet naval captain.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Arkhipov. And those who have read Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, has a nice little snippet in half a chapter on what happened. And very simply, it was that these submarines were out of contact with Moscow. Their orders were never to fire their nuclear torpedoes without explicit orders from Moscow. But they were convinced, since they were getting depth charges all over the place, and there was no word from Moscow for a week, they were convinced, oops, we had lost. And so we might as well get rid of these things, use them or lose them. And they had in their sights several US ships right there in the Caribbean, and they're going to do away with them through nuclear torpedoes. The only problem was these two captains had to get the permission of the political naval captain. Now, we frown at the Russians, the way the party controlled everything. Well, in this case, thank God the party controlled things, because this guy, Arkhipov, says, do you have instructions from Moscow? And they said, no, but if you don't fire. And they didn't fire. They surfaced and found out, whoa, the thing was over, but it was a peaceful ending. Now, what would have happened if several of our ships in that area had been blown up by atomic torpedoes at that point? Well, we kind of suspect we know what would have happened. So lots of these things, these accidents or almost accidents or false warnings, they happen and they're in real life. And so we have to guard against them, as well as some crazy president or some crazy head of strategic arms. SAC is what they used to call it. Now they call it Stratcom. That admiral who commands Stratcom now is on written record as saying, we may have to use these small nukes. It wouldn't be so bad. That's crazy. That's really crazy. It'd get us all very dead, or mostly dead.
Yeah, there's nothing more insane than them trying to shift the possibility and acceptance of limited nuclear exchange into the Overton window of public discourse. I've seen nothing more insane in my short 31-year life than the idea. No, I mean, yeah, sure. A 1 kiloton TAC nuke, all things considered. No, that's not the end of the world. It doesn't stop with that, though. It very, very quickly goes from you and I are stepping outside and we're fighting. The second I pull out a knife, you no longer have a reason to not pull out your gun, and I no longer have a reason to not pull out my shotgun, and you no longer have. It very quickly it goes up, because once that facade of we will not go nuclear falls away, well, if we have TAC nukes and our TAC nukes are better than the Russians' TAC nukes, we clearly not showing restraint. So why would Russia show any restraint? Why would they lose face or lose the war? No, they would just kick those big old thermonuclear megaton monsters in there, and then we would have to. And what a surprise! It's the end of the world.
Yeah, it's crazy, as you say, Tommy, even to discuss this thing as an option. And I think both sides are at the very top, at the presidential level, that is Putin and Biden. They're aware of that. Biden, I've had some very close friends testify that they dealt with Biden for decades. Larry Wilkerson, for example, who was the assistant to Colin Powell for a long time. And Larry is convinced that Biden has learned what the power of these nuclear weapons is, and that accounts for his caution here. Putin, well, he knows too, but he raised it first, okay? He raised it first. And I interpret that as a sign, look, if you put my back against the wall, we have these nuclear weapons, just don't forget.
Yeah.
That's worse than not raising it at all.
Now, do you see, because I don't know, for better or worse, I tend to, I look at the military industrial complex, the quote unquote deep state, the senior executive service, the Pentagon, that kind of entrenched power, the swamp. It, for better or worse, is this massive blob that the president really is just kind of a figurehead for, be it a guy they support or be it a guy they get rid of, like a Kennedy or a Trump or something. That being said, do you really see Biden as being in charge? Because to me, it's very not sure. No, I didn't vote for him. He's not my guy. But this isn't some low hanging fruit attack on him. I mean, he really doesn't seem all there. And if I can see that, a 31-year-old at a distance, I can only imagine some well qualified intelligence officials or generals or people in Stratcom I can only imagine they see that. Do you think that there is anything official or unofficial going on to where they're not going to fire if he says they're going to fire? Is that too idyllic of me? Or is that too pessimistic of me to believe that there is a detached, deep state that kind of does what it wants anyway? But it doesn't really seem like maybe I'm giving us too much credit, but I don't see the guys in the NORAD bunkers and behind the B2 spirits just walking off the cliff. D- is that making any sense? Do you think there's any truth to that? There is maybe a hesitance or a resistance, or they won't give the go code.
A lot of this, depends on personalities. Look at the head of Stratcom right now. A little bit unhinged to be talking about small nuclear weapons. The former head of the NATO military setup, what's his name? That little guy, Stavridis, who's just now a big professor or something. He said, "Oh yeah, we'll have a nuclear war with China in 5-10 years." I wrote a book about it. Hello, but I think that you're right, Tommy. I think they are sort of the minority crazies. Now, I should say that I worked for the CIA for 27 years, and there are two CIAs. The one where I worked, which was the analysis division, which was the reason that Truman set up the CIA. He said he wanted to know what was going on in the world, not from the army, who always made the Soviet threat to be really 3 times as much as it was, and not from the State Department. He didn't want any departmental intelligence. He wanted what he called untreated intelligence. He wanted some central intelligence agency to report directly to him, okay? Not to the state, not to the Pentagon, and tell him like it is. Now, that's what attracted me to the CIA when I was still in college. That's why I signed up, so to speak, after I did my 2 years of active duty as an Army infantry intelligence officer. And I was able to do that for almost the entire 27 years that I worked there. The other part of the agency that sort of grew like Topsy, as you know from reading books, was instituted because people came home from World War II. Now, I have to admit, I was alive for all of World War II. Okay, I was real little, but I was born a week before Nazi tanks rolled into Poland. Okay, so I've been around, and I absorbed the whole thing as a very young person. So after World War II, the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, Tommy, they were incredible folks. I mean, they'd jump in behind army lines, that they'd overthrow governments. And, it was really, these guys were very courageous people. Now, they came back after the war, 1945, 1946, and they got lots of applause. And then they said, well, you want us to hang around? I mean, like, or should we go back to our law firms, our corporations, go back to academia? Now, George Kennan and other high officials at that time said, no, you got to stay, because the Russians can overthrow governments. We need to be overthrown. We need to be able to overthrow governments too. The Russians do this and that. We need you guys. So stay around. And then the question presented itself. I guess we can't have an agency for overthrowing governments. That doesn't sound really, really good. I got it. Let's put them in with the CIA. Now, as I mentioned before, that was not Truman's intent. He wanted something quite different. And once you put the operators in with the analysts, there is the danger that what the operators are trying to do will color the analysis. Happened in Afghanistan. when we gave them stingers, those Islamic, when we gave them stingers, people in the analysis part were involved in supporting the war, right? And so they bought we shot down 50 Soviet aircraft yesterday. Well, it's all BS. They're getting that from the field. They're getting that from the operation. So in my day, there were turnstiles on every floor, 7 floors, right? And a basement. And we analysts could not go over to where the operational officers were, and they could not come through the turnstile to us, except if they had a special thing on their badge, okay? Now, there were problems with that, but we could always call them up on a secure phone. It was far better to keep the two separate. Sort of like in a bank, you keep your investment folks separate, right? And now it's all joined together. And now I'm afraid that it's not as apolitical. It's not as acutely sensitive to real situations in the world. So anyhow, what I'm saying here is that I was part of the CIA, but this one, not this one. Now, this one, the operational part, is part of what I call the Mickey Mat. Okay, you called about, you mentioned the military-industrial complex, right? Well, that's what Eisenhower warned about 60 years ago?
Yeah,
No.
January 17th, 1960.
Yeah. Now, he warned that this tremendous force would gain power, and whether they wanted it or not, they would create such power that they would endanger our democracy. Big deal, right? Okay. Now, they have grown like Topsy. It's not the Mick anymore. It's the Mickey Mat. If your listeners or watchers have a pen and a pencil, if they're still, they're not obsolete, take this down. Mickey Mat. It rhymes with Mickey Mouse, sort of, all right? Now, military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. That embraces pretty much the whole 9 yards. Like, what did I say? Media for? Because media is the linchpin.
Yeah.
And media itself, of course, is owned and operated by the rest of the Mickey Mat. So what we're getting, for example, on Ukraine is just as bad as what we got before Iraq. And we, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, warned before Iraq. For 2 months, we told President Bush, look, this is really crazy. It's going to end up in a catastrophe for everyone, and we couldn't get through. We did 3 memos to him, assuming, as we had to, that he was being led by the nose by people like Cheney and others, to no avail. So what I'm saying here is that the analysis is still really important, but when we talk about the Mickey Mat, Joe Biden would not be president without the full support, and that means lots of money from the PACs of the Mickey Mat. He knows he's not going to be reelected without that. And he knows that with these congressional elections coming up in November, that money is what's going to prevent the Democrats from losing untold votes. So, yeah. Now, is Biden smart enough or compos mentis enough to not let these forces tool around with small nuclear weapons? We just have to pray about that. I mean, I don't know. He doesn't seem to be fully in control, and his instincts seem to be to hate, hate, hate. Hate is never a good motivation. Hate sort of does something to your brain. And when he talks about Putin needing to be removed, I don't think anybody has noticed this, but the day before, the Russians let the word out about Putin, a hunter's laptop. Not only the scurrilous stuff that Hunter shown to do in that laptop, but the fact that he was involved in financing these biological research facilities.
Yeah.
You know, now Biden's human. He's a dad, and he likes
Sure.
his son. We know that. So maybe there's speculation. So maybe he decided, this guy is terrible. This guy, Pucci's trying to denigrate my son, getting him involved in biological warfare. And so he let loose with that final sentence, 9 words that really do not help in any way the situation in Ukraine. So I'll stop there for a while. I just thought I'd give you my Mickey Matt thing because you mentioned Eisenhower. Oh, last thing I'll say on that is that when Eisenhower mentioned this, he said there is an antidote to this. The antidote is a well-informed citizenry.
Yeah. Well-informed and
We ain't got
educated
that.
citizen. Yeah.
Okay? And the reason we ain't got that is because of the media, and the media being controlled by the rest of the Mickey Matt.
Yeah. It's the give a man a fish or teach a man to fish. A well-informed populace. People. That's why I I listen to an audiobook a week. That's why I only started doing it at 29, is because my logic is I think of the General Mattis quote: if you have not read hundreds of nonfiction books by the time you're an adult, you're functionally illiterate. And then his other quote: intuition is subconscious pattern recognition, nothing more and nothing less. So I married the 2 quotes. And my logic is if I read enough books, I will have pattern recognition enough to learn from the history and not repeat it. That's my little logic. But yeah, no, what happens when you do go against Mickey Matt? And I do agree. I don't think it's just the military industrial complex. I think you'd have to throw in P somewhere because it would be pharma. I think it's a black hole. It's sucked in finance. It is the machine. It is coalesced into an event horizon of power and influence. And I mean, didn't Kennedy try to remove that operations aspect from the CIA? Didn't he try to do that and shift it back to like JSOC? And then, didn't Kennedy try to do that? Yeah.
He threatened to
Splinter it into the 1,000 pieces,
the
scatter it
CIA
away.
into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. That was sort of the cry for war as far as Allen Dulles was concerned. And people know this, where I stand on the JFK assassination. It was John Kennedy that got me down to Washington. I was a senior in college when he said, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Now, that didn't sound hokey at the time. That didn't sound trite or obsolete or even political, because the Russians were really, really threatening us then. I mean, it's a real threat. Now, whose fault it was? Well, we can go back in history about that. It's both, okay? But there was a real threat there. So Kennedy was the guy who brought me down, and many of my contemporaries, were brought down there to Washington. Now, he was killed just after my second year in working at the CIA. But, as I read about this, and I read too, James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, is the most well-researched. It benefits from all the previous research that's gone in. It's about 12 years old now. It's far and away the best account of why the deep state did Kennedy in. And it's very clear to me that that's why they won't release the rest of the documents, and why the CIA really is all powerful. Here's President Trump. It was about 4 years ago. Okay, he gets up on a Tuesday and he says, "We're going to release, in accordance with congressional legislation, the rest of the CIA and FBI documents on Kennedy's assassination." That was 9 o'clock in the morning. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gets up and he says, "We're not going to release the rest of those documents because the FBI and the CIA say that this would be a danger to our national security. but we're going to revisit that in 6 months. Okay. So I'm going, oh God, how clear could it? So anyhow, I made a little note in my notebook, and 6 months later, I inquired. Nobody remembered. The press didn't remember. The press is very, very subservient to the intelligence establishment. And so, maybe somebody else remembered. I did, but they didn't do it. And they're still not doing it. Now, you don't have to be a detective to say, I wonder why the hell the CIA and the FBI won't release the rest of those documents. I think you don't need a leap of imagination to figure out why.
No, you got it. Well, Poppy's dead now, so that was probably one of the reasons. But I would imagine there's still some guys alive that maybe need to kick the bucket before it all comes out. I don't think it'll ever come out. I think it'll just be destroyed, which again points to what it is. It's, by default, it kind of answers that question. But I don't really, no, I don't see Biden standing up to them. I mean, they are, it is my belief that Trump was removed. I think what we saw, and again, this is my opinion, I do think that there was a massive election fraud. I don't know. I might be wrong. I'm open to the idea. Got to stay humble. But I think what we saw in November 2020 was, I think we saw the business end of the CIA that the rest of the world's been seeing for 6-7 decades. Guatemala, the Shahs, all the Southeast Asian companies. I think we saw the business end of a well-lubed and pre-planned, all the battleground states freeze at the same time. The media comes out in lockstep, all with the same thing. One of the reasons, that was one of my first suspensions from YouTube when I started this podcast. They all immediately have the little blue tag. The AP has not called the election yet. As more time gets between now and then, I look back at it and I'm like, oh, we saw the machine that we've been using for decades across the world. That's just my 2 cents. Obviously, I don't know if it's true. I have no way to prove it, but I think
you have a good bit of evidence now.
Yeah.
We know that when Hunter Biden's laptop surfaced,
disinformation, it's Russian disinfo.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. And there's one guy, John Cipher, sort of a cipher. He pretends to be one of these CIA senior officers, and he said, "Oh, I'm glad I did. I'm glad we helped get rid of Trump." That's everybody. Well, what did they do? Well, Hunter's laptop was legit. The FBI knew that, but the idea was we got to get rid of Trump, right? And so we'll say it's illegit. And who will we appeal to say this? Well, let's get 50 or so. Let's get 51. Sound a little better. 51 former intelligence senior officials to say we don't have any evidence, but this is consistent with Russian disinformation operations. Now, I don't know if that affected the election any. I suppose it did. But, that's pretty glaring. You have the CIA happy, alumni, I suppose, but happy to participate in this thing. And there were some people on that list of 51, one of whom, I won't mention his name, he knows which end is up. He's had a lot of integrity, and it's a matter of being excluded from the big luncheons or the big dinners. You don't want to leave the brotherhood completely, and so he let his name be on that thing. So okay, so there's that, and then there's the 2016 thing. Now, I should say, my wife always says, Ray, please always mention what you think of Trump. And since, this is opinion, as you express your opinion, my opinion is that Trump was the very worst president the United States has ever had.
He was
even worse than George Bush. I don't want to argue about that.
No, I'm saying I liked him, but I also understand he was a dumpster fire.
So this is where I'm coming from. Now,
Yeah.
how about what happened in 2016? The whole Russia Gate thing was manufactured. Manufactured by whom? By the slick lawyers who worked for Hillary Clinton. And one of them's name is, what's his name? Sullivan, Jake Sullivan. What's he now? Oh, he's the assistant to the president for national security. So, all this is coming out in dribs and drabs in court documents. It's very clear that these well-heeled lawyers have been, were fabricated with this whole legend about Russia being very much in with Trump, to include the celebrated business about Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee. Now, I happen to know a lot about that because I followed it very closely and wrote about it extensively. What happened? Well, if your people are willing to listen to a little rundown of what happened, I'll give it to you. Hillary was doing okay, but not really well before the Democratic National Convention, where she was supposed to be a shoo-in. She had marginalized Bernie Sanders. They had stacked the primaries against him. And all of a sudden, on the 12th of June, 2016, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks announces, we have emails relating to Hillary Clinton, which we're going to publish. Whoa. So Hillary goes to Jake Sullivan, her campaign manager, and says, my God, what are we going to do? If he's got emails that show that we marginalized or that we actually stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders, what's that going to do? What are we going to do? So when was the convention? Convention was on the 22nd, I think, is when it started, of July. So here, middle of June, July, they got maybe 6 weeks to figure out what to do. Now, this is speculation. My notion is they got around the table, and Hillary says, what are we going to do here? How are we going to attenuate the bad effects of the release of these documents? He's probably going to do it. Julian Assange is probably going to do it before the convention. What do we do? And Jake Sullivan, or one of those other young fellows, says, I got an idea. Hillary, what? Blame it on the Russians. Jake, it wasn't the Russians. It was WikiLeaks. Somebody leaked the thing to Wiki. Look, doesn't matter. We blame it on the Russians. We hate WikiLeaks. We hate the Russians just as much. Blame it on the Russians and divert attention from what was in those emails. Those emails, if the worst comes out, shows that you stole the nomination. Well, let's just say the Russians. Why the Russians? And then people won't even look at the emails.
Yeah.
Work like a charm. Now, just to finish this part up, on December 5 of 2017, so right after the election, the head of the cyber firm hired by James Comey of the FBI to find out who hacked into the DNC computers and hacked those emails, testified in court under oath and said, we've looked really closely at all this, and we found out that nobody hacked into those emails. There's no technical evidence at all that anyone hacked into those emails. It would be consistent with previous Russian practice, but there's no technical evidence. That's the 5th of December, 2017. Did anyone tell Robert Mueller, who was deep into his investigation? Well, of course they told him. So why didn't he get that part at least out of the investigation? No, he went with the story, Now, what happened? How do I know that? On the 7th of May, 2020, So do the math. December 2017, now May 2020, one of Trump's loyal intelligence persons says to Adam Schiff, head of the House Intelligence Committee, look, yeah, you haven't released that testimony. If you don't release it tomorrow, we're going to release it. So Schiff releases it. When did I say? The 7th of May, 2020. So what's today? Today is what? Almost April 2000.
March 30th, 2022.
So the New York Times, which hasn't said a word about this, is going for the record. I mean, Schiff's got the record of, I don't know how many months, 26 or so months, and the Times is only up to 22. I mean, hello, this proves all the stuff about Russian hacking. And we had it named because we knew from a technical point of view, with our 3 very senior NSA analysts who are with our veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, they said it couldn't have been a hack. It couldn't have been a hack. And we said that on December 12th, 2016, and we proved it by including as charts, attachments, some of the slides that Edward Snowden brought out into Hong Kong. I mean, we showed the trace routes. We showed that it was, if NSA didn't have any evidence of hacking, ipso facto, there was no evidence of hacking. Now, the testimony by the head of CrowdStrike, if you want to look them up, what's his name? Sean Henry. Look it up, but don't expect to find in the New York Times, the Washington Post. It's been deep sixed, and so everybody keeps saying about Russian hacking. So, long story short, yes, they tried mightily to prevent Trump from becoming president. Now, how did they think they could get away with it? Well, James Comey, the head of the FBI, says in his book, I was operating on the premise that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in for the nomination. Well, if you're operating on that premise and you play fast and loose with the law, but she gets elected, well, somebody could prosecute you. No, they're going to give you, they'll let you stay as FBI director, So, it's pretty easy to understand why they did it. That they did it is really awful. And so on that case, Trump is quite correct in saying this was, well, in my view, an unprecedented operation by the security services, FBI, as well as CIA and parts of the Justice Department, to make sure, A, that Trump didn't win, and then when he did win, to make sure that he was emasculated, that he couldn't do anything with respect to, improving ties with Russia. I mean, hello, what would that mean for the Mickey Man? The Mickey Man needs an enemy, a plausible enemy, and what could be better than the Russians that they already dehumanized by blaming them for Trump? I mean, in my view, there's very few things worse than blaming anybody for President Trump, and that's my personal view. So the deep state is real. The deep state has gotten away with, well, if you include
Kennedy,
Seth Rich,
and Seth Rich, murder.
They got away with murder, and that, of course, is speculation on my part, but I can cite all kinds of evidence that they're hiding it. The FBI has violated the Freedom of Information Act like countless times on
Seth Rich.
So that's a little bit of a digression, but at least I think people need to know that, in my view, even though you may not like President Trump, he was quite right in how they tried to prevent him from being elected, and then just sort of tried to make him powerless after he became elected. And he ended up doing things vis-a-vis Russia. For example, leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. That was a treaty that abolished, that destroyed missiles already in place, SS-20s in Russia and Pershing 2s,
Pershings. Yeah.
yeah, in Western Europe. I mean, I never would have thought that was possible. But with the reduction in warning time, from 20, 35 minutes to maybe 10, sensible people said, hey, let's get rid of those things. We don't need them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And friends of mine, Scott Ritter and others, they went and supervised in Russia, the destruction of these things. And there were Russians that came to us and supervised, or came to Western Europe and supervised the destruction. So those things can be worked out. Why Trump was led to do that, he's been, I don't know, but maybe he wanted to show how strong he was against Russia. And that's the danger of sort of egging, people on to show how strong they are. I just hope that Biden keeps his faculties long enough to prevent those kinds of people from egging him on to doing something really stupid in Ukraine.
I think I do think it's important that you point out that you're no Trump fan. I've talked about in this podcast before, I like Trump, but I think it's good to point out that you don't, because it doesn't make it any. Listen, if I think the election was stolen from Biden, even though I didn't vote for him, I can honestly say I'd sit here saying it was taken from Biden, because what you realize is this is much bigger than Democrat, Republican. This is the acknowledgement of an unelected elite, a power structure who temporarily aligns with your own beliefs. And so we can cheer him on as the good and get rid of Trump any way you can. Well, that same power structure is now going to drag you into World War III. And you have passively given it your approval by not questioning an election. And if we saw what happened in 2016, and time again, it takes a couple of years with some couple months on top of it to see the disinformation coming out as fact. I mean, I was permanently banned from YouTube for my many interviews with Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough for claims that they made that are now coming out to be, oh, the CDC saying, oh, sorry, that was true. Oops, we accidentally did do that. But it doesn't matter. The damage is done. And people look at the same media amalgamation that told us about the need to go into Iraq, the same media amalgamation that said the Russians took the 2016 election, the same media amalgamation that said nothing fishy went on in 2020. They're now telling, and the same one that told us that, hey, there's nothing wrong with these vaccines at all. These doctors who have the patents for inventing them, they're just talking out of their ass. Trust Big Pharma. That same media group is now looking you dead in the eyes and saying, we need to establish a no-fly zone in Ukraine, even if it takes a couple tech nukes.
That's right. As you know, I come from the Bronx, right?
Uh-huh.
And so we used to say, well, I'll give you a for instance. You want a for instance?
Yeah.
Okay, here's a for instance. The neocons, the Wolfowitzes and the Joe Liebermans and the pro-Israeli and pro-violence folks within our administration very much wanted the U.S. to get involved in an overt war to remove Bashar al-Assad from power in Damascus. And so they funded and they raised, they trained these very suspicious characters, many of them tied to Al-Qaeda, to try to overthrow that government. And it wasn't really working out real well. As a matter of fact, the government was claiming back territory hand over fist. Now we're talking 2012, 2013, okay? Now, what happened? Well, Chuck Todd was in a press conference with President Obama. And President Obama had talking points, and he said, under no circumstances will I allow US armed forces overtly to intervene in Syria. Chuck Todd was given a little piece of paper, and at the very end, he says, Mr. President, yes, Chuck, yes, said Chuck. Mr. President, are there no circumstances under which you would allow U.S. forces to be overtly involved? And then, as if he finally reminded himself, Obama said, oh, yes, there is. Yeah, there is. If chemical weapons were used, even if chemical weapons were moved around in Syria, that would be a red line. I would have to change my assessment. I would change my calculus. Bear in mind, August 20, 2012. 1 year forward, August 21, 2013, as a chemical attack outside of Damascus, a little place called Ghouta, blamed on Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad. John Kerry got up 3 days later and said, Bashar al-Assad did it. How many times did Kerry say that? No fewer than 35 times. You can count them, okay? Now, so there was the red line violated. The neocons were gonna get their war, right? So Obama's betwixt and between. By that time, he doesn't want to start another war. I mean, you know, that's a sensible thing, all right? He already sunk millions and maybe $1 billion in this insurgency to dethrone Bashar al-Assad. It didn't. As a matter of fact, Bashar al-Assad was moving. So there was no incentive on Assad's part to use chemical weapons. And to their credit, my former colleagues in the CIA for once told it straight and said, this smells to high heaven, okay? Yeah. In fact, General Clapper, who's not known for his credibility integrity, he goes to Obama during that critical week at the end of August 2013 and says, you know, this is not a slam dunk. John Kerry, he knows a lot about driving boats up the Mekong. He's good, tactical, but he doesn't know much. So it's not a slam. You understand what I mean? Not a slam dunk. Okay. Now, that was the last week in October. What happens? I'm outside the White House, right? With about 300 other people saying, no war on Syria, no war on Syria. It's a Saturday. Obama has a press conference just over the fence. He's had to delay it because what made it so noisy, okay? And then word comes from the press conference, he's not gonna attack Syria. I was the next speaker. I said, if this is true, you know, blah, 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 blah. Well, it was true. As a matter of fact, President Obama said, maybe he remembered that he was a professor of constitutional law, you know? He said, well, you know, we're going to ask Congress what they think about this. And already the British Parliament had voted
no.
Okay, so Obama says, we're not going to do it. Now, what did that do to the neocons? They were livid, okay? Kerry gets up the next Monday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, says the same thing about Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad did it. And then Obama is going off to St. Petersburg for one of these economic summits, a G8 or whatever it was. And Putin takes him aside. This is the first week of September now. And he says, look, President Obama, we recognize the dilemma you're in. We don't want a war in Syria either, but we have persuaded the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons. There's old things left over from Soviet days. They are gonna destroy them. And if you're amenable to this, they will destroy them on a US ship specifically outfitted for such chemical destruction, and we'll do it under UN supervision. What do you think, Mr. Obama? Yeah? Well, tomorrow, the Syrian foreign minister is going to announce this. So tune in tomorrow. Well, he announced it the next day. Obama goes, I don't have to start a war anymore. This is now. How did the neocons react to that? I know, because I was on the top of the CNN building, very fancy building in the middle of Washington, D.C., for a separate interview that evening, okay? And I come out of my little booth there. I was talking with CNN International out of London, and I opened the door. Oh, and I knocked over this little fella. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." He says, "Well, you should be." It was Paul Wolfowitz. Now I said to myself, thank you, Jesus, for my training in nonviolence. It took a lot of training for me to avoid what I want to do to Paul Wolfowitz, right? And then right next to him was Joe Lieberman. And they were watching the boob tube, and they're watching people, their talking heads saying, what a coward Obama was. What a coward not to do what they went through the red line, and they went through he's not going to do it. And then Wolfowitz and Lieberman go into a fancier booth that I was in, and it's across from the elevators. Okay, now, what do I say all that? Well, I went and stood in that very ornate bank of elevators until I came out. And I took the copy of my Constitution out, and I ripped out the page that has Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 11, which says only Congress can authorize war. Yeah. And Lieberman and Wolfowitz said, "Nah, Congress said that. We don't. That's arcane. That's absolutely." So I underlined it, and then they came out. It was a great scene. I was dressed to the bill. You know, I was being interviewed too, right? Not like I look now. So I said, "Paul, Paul Joe, Ray McGovern." Now, you have to know the Washington scene to realize that you can't forget somebody you should know, even though you may not remember his name. But I look decent enough to, "Oh, Ray, how are you?" I said, "Well, I'm good, except I can't believe you klutzes don't know what the Constitution of the United States is." "Well, what do you mean, klutzes?" "Well, here, Joe, Paul, will you hold on for a second?" Paul was slinking away. "Joe, here's Article 1, Section 8. Please take it home, read it, and then really, how long you been in the Senate? 22, 24 years? I forget. But, you know, you ought to read the Constitution." Well, remember, just then, the 6-foot, beautiful redhead who's supposed to protect Joe and Paul from the likes of me appears. And she says, "Oh, Paul, oh, Joe, I'm so sorry." And so I looked at her, I said, "You know, I'm really sorry too. You let these klutzes on, these clowns, and they don't know the Constitution." Well, I went down from there, and suffice it to say, CNN doesn't invite me anymore. It's not even CNN International. What do I say all that? I say all that because these guys wanted their war, right? And they wanted to use this red line thing. Now, Chuck Todd, 2 Sundays ago, is interrogating. He's interviewing the head of NATO, Stoltenberg. Now, Stoltenberg doesn't say anything that he hasn't already approved of the United States. And I can't realize that he was unprepared for this question. But Chuck Todd says, "Well, you know, this no-fly zone, Biden says we can't do that." But you know, Mr. Stoltenberg, if there were a chemical attack, would that be a red line? If there were a chemical attack, would that change the calculus of NATO and the U.S. Chemical attack? He says it 3 times. And Stoltenberg, not prepared. He's not the sharpest blade in the drawer, you know, but he circumlocuted around the whole thing. But there you go. The same guy, Chuck Todd, trying to work from the Mickey Mouse notes how you undercut the president of the United States, who doesn't want a war, and you propel him into a war by a false flag chemical attack. Last thing I'll say on that is that I'm not making this up. When the defense minister of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, gave his State of the Union address, gave his State of the Armed Forces address, very formal thing, annual, on the 22nd of December, it was a very general treatment of the preparedness of the Russian armed forces. But then at the end, he put in this paragraph. He says, we know that there are 120 Americans in Donbass, in those eastern provinces, Russian speaking, and some of them Russian citizens. We know they're practicing for warfare, and there are 120 of them. They're contractors, but they're American contractors, and they're very close to chemical agents. Very close to chemical agents. Now, that's all he says. But to insert a little piece of intelligence into a major speech of this kind had to be considered significant at the time. But what he was saying was, look, we know what's going on. If you want to mount some kind of chemical incident and blame it on us, we're going on record now as saying, we know there are 120 of you in there and that you're very close to chemical agents. I still think it's possible. Why? Because the Ukrainians are really taking it on the chin. You can't believe CNN. You can't believe BSNBC. It's BS. The Russian army is about to take charge of that, what they call cauldron, inside of which with most of the Nazi-led Azov battalion and other people. They're about to do that. They don't care about Kiev anymore, as long as they prevented Ukrainian forces from coming from Kiev. So that's what's going to happen. So what I'm saying here is that there may be a desperate attempt to get Biden to change his calculus, right? And that would come, in my view, from a chemical attack, which Chuck Todd at least says should be a red line, just like he said in August of 2012 should have been a red line. I got the president to say that. So you get the media mousetrapping presidents, and Biden is easily mousetrapped. Witness the fact that the first thing he said about Putin in response to an innocent question from George Stephanopoulos, who's one of the worst. Mr. President, you think Putin's a killer? I thought, oh, yeah, he's a killer. Now he's a monster. Now he should be removed from office. And now he's several other epithets that one president really shouldn't use against another. It's not only de rigueur, it's mischievous, because if you have to end up talking to this guy, it really doesn't help to have called him a war criminal.
It seems like we're marching right into that. Let me 1 sec. For now, I have to wrap this one up because I have another guest coming in. Mr. McGovern, Ray, I would love to have you on again to talk about the developments in Ukraine. I should have scheduled us a longer time period for today. Would you be willing to do another episode?
Yeah, sure. I enjoyed it. And I hope that those viewers, such as they are, would like this alternative view that you won't find on BSNBC or CNN or any of those controlled media things. And what worries me is that you really have to make the effort to tune in to places like yours, or else you're just deluged by this propaganda and you really don't know what's going on. And so you end up being malnourished on real information, which is what Eisenhower warned could do our democracy in if people are not given the right information. So I applaud you in doing this, and sure, I'd be happy to come back.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, you have to be willfully ignorant at this point with an abundance of information. That was wildly insightful, and I look forward to having you on again. Thank you so much, sir. I will send you an email when this is up, and I will email you today, and we will schedule the next one.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Thank you so much, sir.